Have you ever examined a grocery receipt and felt your stomach sink before you even loaded the bags in the vehicle? That's not paranoia, it's history repeating itself. In 1933, during the Great Depression, desperate households lined up in breadlines that stretched for blocks, clutching tin cups for a ladle of soup. Nearly a century later, in 2025, the breadline hasn't disappeared. It's just moved inside Walmart, Costco, and Kroger. The line is at the checkout and the rationing happens in your cart. Back then, unemployment hit 25% and households simply couldn't afford provisions. Today, unemployment sits under 5%. But what good is a paycheck when a gallon of milk costs $6, a loaf of bread $4, and a dozen eggs $5? In 1930, bread cost a nickel. Adjusted for inflation, that should be about $1 today. Instead, we're paying 4 times that. Hunger hasn't vanished, it's wearing a modern disguise. This isn't just inflation, it's a silent collapse of affordability. America isn't on the edge of history. We're living inside it. The Great Depression is no longer a chapter in the past. It's back, it's in your kitchen, and it's staring you in the face every time you shop for provisions. The bread aisle. Let's start with the aisle every household knows best: bread. The simplest provision in the world, once the cheapest. In 2022, you could pick up a loaf of white bread for around $2.50. Today, it's $4.20. That's nearly double in just 3 years. Now, ask yourself, did your paycheck double in the same duration? And bread is just the beginning. Take milk, the backbone of every breakfast table. 2 years ago, a gallon cost $3.50. In 2025, it's breaking the $6 barrier in many states, with some cities seeing costs as high as $6.75. That's an extra $12 to $15 a month for households with children. It doesn't sound catastrophic until you realize every item in the cart has followed the same trajectory. What about protein? Eggs, once the symbol of cheap nourishment, tell a brutal story. In 2022, a dozen cost $1.50. Now $4 to $6 is common. That's more than a 200% increase. Households who rely on multiple cartons a week are suddenly forced to ration, a word we thought belonged to history books. Move to the meat section and the nightmare deepens. Chicken breast, America's go-to dinner protein, has climbed from $2.99 a pound to $5.50, almost doubling. Ground beef passed $7 a pound in many supermarkets, and the question writes itself: when the cheapest proteins become luxury items, what happens to working-class diets? The answer is simple: they collapse. Households pivot to processed provisions, cheaper calories, and long-term health sacrifices. Even the small comforts aren't safe. Coffee, the morning lifeline for 150 million Americans, has surged from $5 a pound to $8, with premium blends crossing into double digits. Imagine starting every day with the reminder that even your caffeine is part of the crisis. This isn't just about numbers, it's about dignity. Grocery shopping used to be routine. Now it's a weekly stress test. Parents put back items at the register. Seniors on fixed incomes cut fresh produce in half. College students skip meals outright. What once felt ordinary now feels like survival. The store problem. If you think shopping smart will save you, think again. Even the cheap giants, the stores households once trusted to stretch a dollar, are now part of the crisis. Take Walmart, long advertised as the champion of low costs. In 2023, a 5-pound bag of flour cost $2. Today, that same bag is $3.50. That's a 75% jump. A 10-pack of frozen chicken breasts once sold for $10. Now it rings up at $15, a 50% increase on a single staple. Multiply that across a cart of 20 or 30 items, and the mathematics is devastating. Costco, the warehouse giant, built its empire on bulk savings. But in 2025, even bulk is breaking budgets. A case of 24 canned tomatoes that sold for $18 just 2 years ago is now $25. That's $7 more for the same steel cans of tomato paste. Peanut butter, the giant tub that households relied on for children's lunches, went from $7 to $10. It sounds small, $3 here, $7 there. But across a year of bulk shopping, that's hundreds of extra dollars draining out of already stretched wallets. Whole Foods, once mocked as whole paycheck, has turned into something even worse. A preview of where mainstream costs are headed. Organic apples that averaged $2 a pound in 2023 are now $3.50. Almond milk, once $3, has surged to $4.50 per carton. A household swapping dairy for plant-based products is now punished for the switch, paying $1.50 more per carton every single week. Kroger, Safeway, Publix, no chain has been spared. Analysts reported that between January 2024 and January 2025, the average supermarket basket increased 12.8% nationwide. International organizations echoed the alarm, warning that global provision costs in 2025 remain 30% above pre-pandemic levels. That's not a headline. It's a death sentence for working-class budgets. So, where do households turn? Nowhere. Whether it's Walmart's everyday low costs, Costco's bulk savings, or Whole Foods premium organic, every logo tells the same story. Provision costs are rising faster than paychecks, and the promise of affordability is dead. The grocery cart has become the new battlefield of American life, and no matter which store you push it through, you're losing money at every aisle. The why behind the crisis. So, why are grocery bills exploding like this? Why does every trip to the store feel like a financial ambush? The answer isn't just one thing, it's a chain reaction of inflation, broken supply lines, climate disasters, and government policies that hit wallets like hidden taxes. Let's start with inflation. Official reports show grocery costs rose another 11.2% in 2024 on top of a 13% increase in 2023. Stack those together, and you're looking at nearly 25% inflation in just 2 years. Wages, meanwhile, crawled up only 4% annually. That's the mathematics of disaster. Paychecks rising $2,000 a year, while grocery bills jump $5,000. Households aren't just falling behind, they're drowning. Now layer in new tariffs. In early 2025, sweeping tariffs on imports from China, Mexico, and Europe were billed as protecting American workers. But at the checkout counter, they feel like a provision tax. Rice imports jumped 20% overnight. Canned tuna surged 25%, and imported cheeses spiked nearly 30%. Even coffee beans, most of which come from abroad, rose another 15% in just 6 months. A household that once spent $20 a week on rice, seafood, and coffee is now paying closer to $30. That's $500 more a year, sucked straight out of household budgets by tariff wars. And tariffs don't just raise costs on imports, they trigger retaliation. Mexico slapped tariffs on U.S. corn and beef. China taxed soybeans and wheat. The result, farmers at home are squeezed, forced to pay more for fertilizer and feed, while shoppers pay more for the final product. It's a lose-lose cycle. The farm bleeds, the consumer starves. Then there's the supply chain, a term that sounds boring until you realize it's the invisible rope choking your grocery bill. Remember the pandemic shortages of 2020? Those never fully healed. Transportation costs are still inflated nationwide. Shipping a truckload of produce from California's Central Valley to New York now costs 30% more than it did in 2022. That cost doesn't disappear. It's stamped into the cost tag on every tomato, every apple, every head of lettuce. Climate disasters pile on top. Government reports showed that extreme droughts in the Midwest cut corn yields by 15% in 2024, while floods in California destroyed entire fields of strawberries and lettuce. Global wheat costs jumped 18% after poor harvests in Ukraine and Argentina. Provisions aren't just scarce, they're scarcer. And that scarcity writes dollar signs across grocery shelves. And while households struggle, corporations thrive. Major retailers aren't losing money, they're reporting record profits. Some companies' annual reports showed net earnings up 22% even as consumers screamed about inflation. Major meat producers quietly raised meat costs by an average of 14%, pocketing billions in profit. Business studies called it greedflation, the practice of raising costs well beyond actual cost increases simply because desperate consumers have no choice but to pay. Put all these forces together and the picture is chilling. Inflation strips paychecks, tariffs act as stealth taxes, climate disasters slash supply, corporations fatten margins, households caught in the crossfire watch their grocery bills morph into monsters. The grocery aisle is no longer a marketplace. It's a pressure cooker where global politics, corporate greed, and natural disasters converge. And every beep at the checkout scanner isn't just a transaction. It's a reminder that America's cost of living is spiraling out of control with no off-ramp in sight. The human toll. What happens when the cost of survival climbs faster than paychecks? The answer is visible in kitchens across America. Households are skipping meals. Parents are quietly consuming less so their children can have more. Seniors are choosing between groceries and prescriptions, and the data backs it up. A 2025 report revealed that 1 in 4 U.S. households skipped meals at least once a week because they couldn't afford enough provisions. Compare that to just 1 in 10 households in 2019. The number has more than doubled in 6 years. Latest surveys show that 17 million American households now live with provision insecurity, meaning they don't know if their next meal will be affordable. That's nearly 50 million individuals, a population larger than California, living on the edge of hunger in the richest country on earth. But it's not only about hunger, it's about what fills the plate. When milk is $6, eggs are $5, and chicken is $6 a pound, households don't stop consuming. They downgrade. Fresh produce and lean proteins are replaced by processed fillers, instant noodles, canned pasta, dollar menu fast provisions. A recent public health study found that 68% of lower-income households cut back on fresh fruit and vegetables in 2024, substituting cheaper, less nutritious options. The result is predictable: rising obesity, diabetes, and heart disease in communities already struggling to stay afloat. And then there's the mental cost. Psychological associations reported a 34% increase in anxiety and depression diagnosis linked directly to financial stress over provisions between 2022 and 2025. Imagine the daily strain: a mother putting back apples at checkout because she's over budget, a father working two jobs yet unable to afford a full week's groceries, a child who notices the refrigerator is always half empty. These aren't isolated anecdotes. They're a nationwide pattern of quiet desperation. Provision banks, once the last resort, are now overwhelmed. In 2025, networks of provision banks reported distributing over 6 billion meals, a record high. Some centers report lines wrapping around city blocks with demand up 40% compared to 2021. What looks like a modern breadline is exactly that, a digital echo of the Great Depression, but with vehicles waiting in drive-through donation lanes instead of men queuing with tin cups. And hidden beneath all this is debt. Americans put $68 billion worth of groceries on credit cards in 2024, an all-time high. Households aren't just purchasing provisions, they're financing it. Interest rates over 20% mean that a $200 grocery bill can balloon into $250 if not paid immediately. It's a vicious cycle: purchase now, owe later, and sink deeper every week. The cruel irony: the United States wastes nearly 30 to 40% of its provision supply annually. While millions go hungry, billions of dollars worth of provisions rot in landfills due to supply inefficiencies and retailer overstock. It's a grotesque imbalance: scarcity at the checkout line, waste in the dumpsters. The human toll of this crisis cannot be measured in receipts alone. It's measured in skipped dinners, in children consuming cereal for supper, in the silent anxiety of households living one bad week away from hunger. The grocery store is no longer just a place to shop. It has become the stage where America's inequality plays out in real duration, with billions of dollars in profits on one side and empty refrigerators on the other. Where this ends, where does this end? That's the question haunting economists, policymakers, and millions of households staring at shrinking grocery bags. If provision costs rose 25% in just 2 years, what happens if the same trend continues into 2026? The answer is chilling: a middle-class America that looks less like the world's richest nation and more like a nation teetering on famine. Forecasts suggest that provision costs could rise another 7 to 9% in 2025, with staples like dairy and meat leading the surge. That means by 2026, a gallon of milk could pass the $7 mark, a carton of eggs could hit $6, and ground beef could settle near $9 per pound. For a household of 4, that translates into weekly grocery bills of $300 or more, or nearly $15,000 per year, an amount that rivals the cost of college tuition in many states. But the danger isn't only cost, it's access. Already, 19 million Americans live in provision deserts, areas with limited access to affordable groceries. Analysts warned that number could climb past 25 million by 2026, as inflation forces supermarkets in poor and rural neighborhoods to close. When stores shutter, residents are left to rely on overpriced corner shops and fast provision chains, locking entire communities into unhealthy, expensive diets. Debt is another ticking time bomb. In 2024, Americans charged $68 billion in groceries on credit cards. If interest rates remain above 20%, that could exceed $80 billion by the conclusion of 2025, creating a generation of households financing provisions like they finance vehicles. Picture it: groceries purchased in January still being paid off in July with an extra 25% added in interest. That's not just unsustainable, it's catastrophic. And the tariffs are escalating. Analysts warned that if current tariff plans continue into 2026, provision inflation could spike another 12 to 15%. Imagine a scenario where tariffs add $800 a year to the average household's grocery bill on top of inflation's $5,000 increase. That's a hidden provision tax larger than many Americans' entire utility bills. Global instability compounds the risk. Climate scientists warned that continued droughts in the Midwest and floods in California could slash yields of corn, wheat, and lettuce by 10 to 20% in 2026. International organizations project that global wheat costs could climb another 15% if conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East persist. America doesn't live in a bubble. When global provision costs jump, U.S. shoppers bleed at the register. The real fear: hunger crossing into the suburbs. Provision insecurity has long been associated with poverty in inner cities and rural towns. But in 2025, research shows that 41% of suburban households report cutting back on groceries due to costs. By 2026, the image of hunger won't be isolated to neglected neighborhoods. It will appear in cul-de-sacs, in two-income households that simply can't keep up. And what happens to society when a nation can't consume? History gives us clues. Social unrest in the 1930s, provision riots in the 1970s. Analysts warned that if provision inflation persists, widespread civil unrest cannot be ruled out. Already, surveys show 68% of Americans blame government policies for rising costs, while 52% believe corporations are cost gouging. Anger is building, and hunger has always been gasoline on the fire of protest. This is the America we are sleepwalking into. A nation where grocery shopping becomes a luxury, where breadlines return in digital form, where millions live one empty refrigerator away from despair. The Great Depression isn't just history, it's a warning. And in 2025, that warning is flashing red.